We take our fancy telescopes and point them in every direction, hoping to see something that resembles life on Earth. But there's nothing. Crickets. Even the crickets are like, what is going on here? So what do? We invent bigger, meaner telescopes that can see even further and clearer, and nothing. Just a big bowl of nothing. So at what point do we say that maybe fancier telescopes aren't the answer? Maybe the problem starts earlier than that, before we even pick up a telescope. What if looking for ourselves in outer space is the wrong approach? I mean, we're in a place where we're alive and everything outside of our planet looks dead. Where it seems like special circumstances or coincidence made life possible on our planet. So we naturally look for other planets that might support this special circumstance or coincidence. But here's the kicker. We tend to forget that in this universe, there's this thing that is famous or notorious for making organisms believe they're the only ones. It does this to everyone without exception. And all these organisms who are led to believe they're the only ones all find out at some point that they weren't alone. They were isolated. In fact, they go from thinking they're all alone to understanding they weren't even as alive as every other organism around them, which up until that point, they probably didn't believe was even real. And of course, this mighty force that's responsible for all cases of organic isolation is none other than the process of gestation, or in our case, the womb. This process is notorious for making a developing organism seem like it's all alone, when the opposite is actually true. Now, it's easy to observe this at our scale. That's the origin of all of us individuals, and we see it happening all around us. But what happens when we apply this concept of isolation, or gestation, to the planetary scale? Can we even do this? Well, first we need to examine the symptoms. Are there any unique similarities between what we experience at our level and what we're seeing at the planetary level? Now, I know the idea of comparing the two might seem a bit weird at first because the size difference is huge, and our planet looks like a sphere that's just spinning away without any observable similarity to anything we experience on the surface of this planet. But if there's even the slightest chance that our planet is following a similar pattern of isolation to what we find down here, then it makes a lot of sense that everything would look different. Otherwise, what's the point of being in isolation if we could easily recognize it's happening? So what we're probably going to have to do here is put away our current assumptions and really start from the most basic observations we can make. So starting from scratch, if we forget about who's alive and who isn't for just a moment, what we have is a sphere, and it's surrounded by lots and lots of other spheres. And if we were to examine the relationship between our sphere and all the other spheres out there, it kind of seems like not a lot is happening, except for one other sphere. There's one other sphere out there that has a truly unique relationship with our sphere. And you've already guessed it, it's our sun. So staying as neutral as we can here, if we really pull back and just remove the sheer scale of it all, what we're left with is a sphere that's getting its life from an outside source and is even wrapped in a life-supporting salty fluid. Now, you could say that even though it looks different to what we're used to, these are pretty much the trademarks of gestation. I mean, you've probably already noticed how this planet just happens to be in this odd situation where it seems like we're the only ones with life. But the sphere we belong to is not really the source of this life. There's a bigger sphere that's giving it to us. But imagine you're removing yourself from the whole situation and you're looking at this with a totally clean slate with no bias whatsoever. You've got big sphere giving life to small sphere, or enabling life for small sphere. The logical assumption would be that for big sphere to be compatible and take part in this process that gives small sphere life, it needs to be more alive than small sphere in every possible way, and that there shouldn't be anything that small sphere has that big sphere wouldn't have, including life itself, since big sphere is the one that's enabling it in the first place. But then you have small sphere saying, no, I'm the one that's alive. And the sphere that's responsible for my life is actually not alive at all. And if you ask small sphere, hey small sphere, why do you think you're more alive than the big sphere that's giving you your life? And small sphere says, because all I see when I look over is a big ball of plasma. I don't see any life there. How can anything live on a big fireball? Which is a really good argument, isn't it? Small sphere says there's nothing there. So how can an empty fireball be alive at all? But now that we've examined the symptoms, we can look at small sphere and realize that small sphere is suffering from a case of isolitis. Side effects include believing your eyes and your senses are better suited to interpret reality than things like common sense and straightforward examples from nature. That's not an actual thing, by the way, but the point is this. If a large sphere is supplying life to a smaller one, you can't say the smaller one is more alive because your eyes said so. I mean, you can, but you'd be wrong, because you're forgetting that getting your life from an outside source always goes hand in hand with isolation, making the one that's receiving life, including all of its smaller members, believe life is only happening where they are and nowhere else. And it's true, for us life is only happening here and nowhere else. But for every single sphere around us, going by this same rule, life will be happening. And it's probably happening in ways that surpass anything we could ever experience as long as we remain in a state of isolation. When you believe that our sphere is alive while all the other endless amounts of spheres out there aren't, you're making the very bold assumption that your eyes have access to anything significant beyond our own atmosphere. So I'll ask you this. Can you breathe in space? Can you smell in space? Can you hear in space? And yet here you are trying to convince yourself that all of these limitations imposed by nature don't include sight for whatever reason. Well, going by common sense and examples from nature, we can't see what's actually there beyond our own atmosphere. We can see a little bit, we can see planets and stars, but we're not getting the full picture. It's like a no-access zone for us. You can get your body up there, but if you can't breathe, hear, see, or smell, then can you really say that you've been there? But the really crazy thing about all this is how obvious this whole thing is. I mean, what a coincidence. It's the ones belonging to the small sphere that are also saying they're more alive than their own life source. If you're part of a system that's getting its life from an outside source and also believes it's more alive than that source, then you really need to look at nature and see if there are any examples of this happening at all, anywhere. And of course, it's happening everywhere. Isolation is nature's number one mechanism for creation. That's how nature does it. And that's really the moment we need to drag that line between our situation and the one and only thing that tries to convince us we're the only ones in existence. That's what this process does. You can't be in a universe or an existence where you look around and think that the empty planets and stars around you means there's nothing there. You can't be part of a system that already has a mechanism inside of it that isolates organisms in their earliest stages and still believe it's anything other than intentional, well thought out, purposeful isolation. Not for us as individuals, because you've already been inside the womb as an individual, but for our planet specifically. And if our planet is isolated, then so are we by association. Very similar to how your brain cells were when you were inside the womb. So thinking we're all alone, not seeing life on other spheres, according to nature's own example, this means the opposite is actually true. It means the planets we see as empty are actually bursting with life. It means the blazing plasma ball we call our sun has a normal crust that we can't see thanks to our current situation, with life on that surface as we speak. How can we ever think for a second that our sun could pass on life over to us without being alive first? How can something that doesn't have everything we have here plus so much more also just happen to be so compatible that it initiates the process that provides you with the oxygen you're breathing at this moment? The sun and the planets, they're not broken. They're not malfunctioning. There's nothing wrong with them. They don't need to be a certain distance from other stars for life to flourish. All they need is for us to understand that we're the ones with the problem. If you want to call being part of a system that's isolated a problem. Although, let's be honest, they probably couldn't care less about our situation because they've all been through it at some point. There's nothing special about it. All of the other spheres around us have either already gone through or will go through the exact same process as us, believing they're even more alive than their own life source, and that the star that was literally responsible for keeping them alive was just a fireball and nothing more. Until that was no longer the case and everything changed for them. They say that the odds of us being here is 1 in 60 billion. So what makes more sense to you? Because this is what it really comes down to. Believing that by some random fluke we appeared in a place with no life? Or the logical alternative that we're in a place where absolutely everything is alive, but all access has been denied? Just think about these two options. One has a statistical probability of absolutely nothing, and the other we see examples of literally everywhere we look, and is based on the most common element for initial growth that nature has to offer: isolation. Isolation fits perfectly with our current situation because it tells us that having life on planets is actually a straightforward process for nature, and that there's no such thing as 1 in 60 billion. You don't need special circumstances, because the same rules that apply to our scale here will apply to all other scales also, with the only things that really change being the size and time scale. But not because the process itself is bigger or slower, it's because of where we are or what we are in relation to the exact same process. So there's really nothing unfamiliar or special about our situation at all. In fact, whenever you think your situation in nature is special, it usually turns out to be the opposite. It's just like we thought we were the center of the universe, and look how that turned out for us. Well, now we think we're the center of life in the universe, and the result is going to end up being exactly the same. The real problem here is that our current beliefs are based on what we see. And isolation assumes what we see doesn't include those layers of life that all spinning spheres are made with. That means that whatever we find in outer space has absolutely nothing to do with what our eyes are trying to convince us is real. This is what we see, and this is what anyone that's not part of our planet sees. For everyone else, our planet is just as empty as how we see their planets. And it's the same for us. This is what we see, but it's not what the folks belonging to these planets see. And it's the same thing with stars. This is what we see, but that's not what's there for anyone else. And if you're thinking that certain gadgets could detect that life if it was really there, then you need to remember that our planet's isolation means it has zero jurisdiction in any life-related matter outside of its own bubble. So detectors or sensors, they'll never be able to find anything as long as our planet remains isolated. So you might as well pack up your telescopes because they won't show you what's right there in front of us. Now, at this point, you probably have lots of questions. Like, if our planet is an actual fetus, then where did its arms and legs go? And what are we in relation to this planet? Are we this planet's neural network? Is this how brain cells experience the inside of the womb? Alright, so now we need to take this up a notch and explore something about our very own visual cortex. And before you say, oh no, what can the visual cortex, this boring screen at the back of our brains that connects us to the world around us, what can this possibly tell us about anything? Well, the screen at the back of our brains might turn out to be the missing piece of our existential puzzle. But to explain what it is about the visual cortex that makes it so relevant to what's happening, we're going to need the help of the most unlikely creatures you could ever imagine: bats. Because even though bats use their visual cortex to a certain extent, there's something else that overrides it. And that gives us a glimpse into how anyone with a visual cortex, including ourselves, is interacting with it, thanks to bats that have it, but don't use it exclusively. And the thing about our visual cortex that makes it so important is the fact that it's upside down. Or more specifically, our eyes that act as an actual lens flip over the image that is then relayed to the visual cortex. And that's what a lens does, just like your camera lens because of its shape. So what ends up being displayed on your visual cortex is an upside down image of the potential world in front of you. And how do we know this is true? Well, thanks to a few things, like a newborn baby who reaches up for something that's down, because the baby is adjusting to how the world is in relation to how it's displayed on its visual cortex. Now, this again can be debated, and it is debated whether a baby actually goes through this reorientation. But it's this next thing that really is that reference we've been looking for. And that's the good old bat, who uses a sonar system to connect with the world around it. Now, assuming that the image displayed on the visual cortex really is upside down, Do you really think that it's some kind of a bizarre coincidence that a mammal that doesn't completely rely on its visual cortex also just magically happens to be in an inverted position to all these other mammals that do rely on it? A mammal that doesn't even notice that its eyes are flipping over the image of the world because its sonar is overriding whatever its visual cortex is trying to dictate. Well, it isn't a coincidence, because what bats and newborn babies are telling us about ourselves is that the part of you that's viewing the visual cortex, the real you that's looking at the screen, is doing it from an upside down position. Your visual cortex is upside down because you're upside down. You are inverted from your own body. The bat is the only exception because of its sonar, which makes its body align with the inner bat that's supposed to be viewing its visual cortex, creating this very unique situation where both body and viewer are aligned. Unlike us, where body and viewer are inverted. In other words, because the bat's reality is dictated by its sonar and not by its visual cortex, the bat's body is aligning with its core, or inner viewer, or any other words you want to use to describe the thing that's actually moving the body. The bat shows us that this inner viewer is real, thanks to the fact that it's upside down and doesn't rely on its visual cortex at the same time. Which means we're all controlling our bodies from a position that's opposite to how our body is. And the first few weeks and months of our lives are dedicated to building the necessary skills in adjusting to a world that's physically upside down from us. So much so that a few more months and years down the road, and you're so good at controlling your body from this inverted position that it doesn't even seem like there was ever an adjustment period. But more importantly, we start to believe that there's no difference between us and our bodies. They mold in our minds into the same thing. But when you're believing this, when you're saying to yourself, I am my body, you're literally physically doing it from the opposite position to how your body is. Because you are the viewer that's looking into your visual cortex. You're not the eyes and not the head or the body they're connected to. So the only real question here is why? Why would nature have everyone in an inverted position to their bodies? What's the purpose of all this? And you've been seeing the answer to this question every day of your life. What in nature is upside down from itself? And the answer is vegetation. Just like you, a tree also has two parts to it that are inverted from each other, the tree and its root. With vegetation, these two parts are physically connected, but with everyone else, it's a mobile connection. What you really are is a kind of vegetation that moves, and I'll prove it to you. You probably don't remember this, but once upon a time, a long time ago, you looked very different to what you are now. You were once a seed, a single sperm cell that managed to fertilize an egg. Now, that's a pretty big thing to have in common with vegetation, but it doesn't end here. You are a seed, and in the whole 9 months that you spent inside the womb, what was one of the most important things that happened to you that made it all possible? This is something that's very well known, but we've casually skipped over the most important detail about our own existence. You were planted in your mother's uterus. Let me repeat that. You are a seed that was planted. So if you're a seed that had to be planted, how in the world can you think that having an inverted root doesn't apply to you? Why? Because you get to move around? Do you really think nature is incapable of giving you a different kind of root that lets you move? Or that the most crucial condition for life on planet Earth will just skip over us? Nothing can live on the surface without representation on the inside of our planet. And it doesn't matter if we're stuck to the ground or get to move around, because the inside of our planet is where life actually happens, and the surface is where it all plays out. The part of you that's looking into your visual cortex has to be inverted because you're seeing the surface from inside the planet. Life on the surface is happening from the inside, and that's where you really are. Now, you might be surprised by this, and you might not want to believe this, but as long as you're a seed that was planted, then it's unavoidable, really. And this brings us to the most unavoidable thing of them all. Now that we're faced with this realization that we all have physical roots inside this planet, the big question is, what do all these roots look like? What does a human root or animal root look like? And this brings us all the way back to what we talked about at the start. If our planet is in a state of gestation, if our planet is getting its life from an outside source, if our planet is wrapped in a salty fluid and showing all the signs necessary for us to understand that it's an actual fetus, then why does our planet look like a sphere? What are all of these spinning spheres all around us? You wanted to know what mobile roots look like? What your root looks like? Well, you've been exposed to mobile roots your whole life. You've been looking at them and mystified by them from the day you were born. These planets and stars all around us, they might look like empty, lifeless spinning spheres to us. Now guess what? In nature, roots don't need to look good. They don't need to be pretty. They're more functional than anything else because they're meant to last a really, really long time. And that's exactly what a human root looks like. You see, if we're this planet's neural network, well, that means our planet is part of our galaxy's neural network, which means the same Milky Way galaxy that happens to look like a flat disk to all of us is just an ordinary planet to our planet, with an inside and a surface. We only see the surface of planet Earth, where we are now, without the inside. The inside is visually missing for us, but it's the exact opposite when we're looking at the Milky Way. We see the inside of the Milky Way, but without the surface. The surface is visually missing for us, giving us the two sides we need to see to get the full picture of what life is really made of. The inside and the surface. If you could crack open our planet, what you'll find is a spinning galaxy. And in this galaxy, you'll see lots of planets and stars. They'll all be a lot smaller, and they're probably spinning way faster than what we're used to seeing. But that's because we're one scale smaller than the planetary scale. And one of these smaller, faster spinning spheres inside our planet is your sphere. One of those spheres is you, the physical you that's been spinning from the moment you were made. And you've never done anything else. You've never really walked or talked or moved. Your body has. Your body's done a lot of things, but your body's got nothing to do with you. Yeah, it's connected to you and it lets you explore the surface, but that's not you. It never was you. And not just you, everyone who ever lived also. They're all still here. You see, the really amazing thing about these spinning roots is that unlike your body that needs to eventually die, your root was built to last. And unless your root was made fairly recently, you've probably been spinning inside our planet for a really long time, moving from one body to the next one and the next one without even knowing it. So you've experienced a lot, and all those experiences you've had on the surface meant your root was growing as a result. In fact, the very first person who ever lived needs to still be alive today, because our roots are all spinning around that first person. I mean, that person's body has been dead for thousands of years, but the first person's root would still need to be alive and spinning. Otherwise, none of us could be alive. It would be like leaves with no branches, just connected to the air. If the leaves are disconnected, they die. And if we were disconnected from the person that acts as our physical foundation, then we couldn't be alive also. What we all are is kind of like an extension of that first person, and the extension can't live without its source. So yeah, everyone is still here, and your roots are making sure that it stays that way. And all this time, you were so worried about preserving your body. You were so preoccupied with keeping the body going, protecting the body at any cost, even if it meant you had to go to war with these other bodies you labeled as your enemies. But now that you know that no one can touch you or your enemies, now that you know that no one can really die, now that you know that nature knows what it's doing, that nature is just as smart and just as advanced as it looks, now that you know that nature is choosing to be silent on purpose, would you still be okay with anything harmful happening to other people, knowing that nature is protecting them in the same exact way that nature is protecting you? And I mean, nature put a whole planet's crust in between you and anyone on the surface who would ever try to harm you. That's taking your personal safety to a whole new level. Now that you know this, do you still feel that need to preserve the body at any cost? Would you say that maybe the opposite attitude was really the way to go all along? Maybe making sure that those enemies of yours live at any cost, even if they don't like you. Maybe, dare I say, your compassion and patience was what this journey on the surface was all about. I have to say, I overemphasized how similar we are to vegetation. I mean, we all have roots just like vegetation, but the thing that really separates us from everyone else is action. Our actions are like a language. We speak to nature through action. So even though you're not your body physically, how you use it on the surface means everything. The big side effects that comes with humanity being isolated in a dark bubble is the fear that it creates, which brings out the worst in everyone. But despite our surroundings being dark and terrible, some people, without even knowing it, have managed to see beyond that, realizing and understanding that it's better to be a kind, compassionate, patient, good-hearted person, even if the whole world is trying to push you in the other direction. And I don't mean the type of people that want everyone to believe they're good. I mean genuine kindness. And don't confuse kindness with being perfect. None of us will ever be perfect, and making mistakes is a very important part of this process we're in. But implementing the lessons from our mistakes and consciously moving towards kindness, it isn't a recommendation. It's a requirement. But if you're thinking that this is impossible, that kindness can't possibly be a condition or a requirement for being here, then just think of what's going to happen to us when this planet's gestation is over. So let's wrap up with the really important takeaway from all this, which is what happens when our planet is no longer isolated? What happens when this planet is born? What is everything going to look like, and how different is it going to be to what we experience now? It's really hard to imagine a world that's different, isn't it? And it's even harder to imagine our current reality changing into something that's different. But you know what? Once the fetus moves out of its bubble, its whole biology changes. We're talking extreme changes, like being submerged in water to living with air, like getting its life externally to being self-sufficient. These things are huge changes. So just imagine how those changes translate to the brain cells of a fetus that's literally morphing into something new. Our planet is currently getting its life from an outside source, but the moment our planet is born, this will stop being the case. From that point onwards, our planet will be completely 100% self-sufficient, with life originating here and nowhere else. You see, we think that our distance from the sun is the reason we're all alive, but in nature, when you're depending on someone else for life, it's always temporary. And just because the scale got bigger and a whole lot slower, nature's rules don't bend or break. So yes, our planet will be making its own life. If you don't think that's possible, then why do you believe the process of birth is even possible? Why do you believe a water-bound fetus can change into an air-bound newborn baby? Is it because you see it happening all around you, but you've never seen a planet going through a similar transition? Of course you haven't, because the thing that you're so used to seeing at our scale will only happen once for us on the planetary scale as a collective, because we're seeing it from the very unique perspective of its neural network. That's the whole point. So being self-sufficient is one thing, but what about the most massive visual component that we all take for granted? What's going to happen to this empty dome above your head? If you've gotten really used to living with half a day of empty bright skies and another half of empty dark skies, then it's a shame, because that's all going away. You can literally kiss nighttime goodbye, because we're in a collision course with something that's so different to what we have now. You see, after the birth of our planet, we'll be thrown into a new form of existence, and the first thing to go will be this virtual barrier we call the sky. There is so much color, light, and information hiding behind our day and night sky that it's just waiting to burst in here at the moment our planet is born, with infinite amounts of information waiting to interact with our brains at their highest capacities. These open skies will be the main point of focus for all of us, instead of focusing on whatever is happening on the surface of our planet like we do now. And we're talking waves of information coming through. As this planet's neural network, our purpose is to help our planet absorb this. This is what we were made for. But there's really nothing coming through at the moment, is there? Here's an interesting fact that can help us understand what's really going on up there. Did you know that although sunlight is neutral white, holding all the colors inside of it, it's actually showing up or peaking on the green part of the spectrum? But we don't see it that way when we're up there, do we? At the moment, our eyes are seeing it as neutral or white light in outer space without the ability to see the sun for what it really is. But not for much longer. As it turns out, it's like a green field of light up there that we don't have access to thanks to our planet's current situation. But if never-ending light wasn't enough, there's another big change we're about to experience, because there's another element that we're so used to, but we'll barely even remember it when our planet is born. This salty fluid, which covers the Earth, is the visual equivalent of embryonic fluid to the fetus's brain cells. Our oceans, right now, are an important component in the cycle of life on Earth. But once our planet is born, these vast bodies of water will no longer be needed, and will completely cease to exist. To say that it is impossible for us to live without oceans is to say that a newborn baby can't live without embryonic fluid after it's already left the womb. The baby's biology will change to accommodate and adjust to its new environment, and so will we have to change, along with our planet, to accommodate for life beyond the confines of our present situation. A world without oceans, where light is constant and never-ending, where the infinite amount of living planets and stars are available and free for us to explore and connect with. This is the next reality, and it's the natural next step for each and every brain cell, person, planet, star, or galaxy that ever lived. So remember, this journey comes down to your alignment of choice. You can either align yourself with what the world seems to be now, a world engulfed with physical darkness, where people's beliefs are based on what they see, and their decisions are influenced by the notion that this darkness is permanent. Or you can align yourself with something you can't see and can't feel, and all you can really do is understand it, aligning yourself with how the world will be, and the notion that we're part of a very familiar process that starts inside darkness and moves into light. But either way, the choice, as always, is yours. נו, אז מה אתם אומרים? חשבתם שבאמת יש סיכוי שאנחנו נהיה ראשונים פה? שהכל מתחיל ונגמר אצלנו? כאילו שאנחנו חכמים והטבע לא, כאילו שאנחנו בחיים והטבע לא? זה לא מה אנחנו, זה לא מי אנחנו, זה איפה אנחנו. אם לא נבין את זה עכשיו, אז נבין את זה אחר כך.